Raju, you can
Yes,
start.
it started. Yeah.
Okay.
Good morning, all of you. Welcome to the Thinking Thursdays Research Seminar Series. We are very happy to welcome renowned Iranian American author, educator, and cultural critique, also a philosopher of technology today with us, Dr. Tony Kashani. And he is, of course, in a different time zone, as all of you can imagine. It's nighttime over there. Dr. Tony Kashani is going to speak today, as all of you know, about artificial intelligence, neoliberalism, and human condition in the 21st century. Let me share with you briefly about Dr. Kashani's background. He has been really focusing on interdisciplinary scholarship and pedagogy on humanities in the digital age, and his scholarship is also very much focused on social justice issues. In this university, as all of you know, we are very much focused on interdisciplinary scholarship and research and teaching pedagogy. So Tony Kashani's work very much aligns with the kind of work we do over here. He was born in Tehran to Azerbaijani parents, an ethnic minority in Iran. He grew up speaking Farsi and Turkish, and after migrating at the critical age of 15 to his adopted home in California, English became his primary language of intellectualism. Speaking three languages and being aware of three distinctly different cultures at once gave Kashani the impetus to seek a philosophy of cosmopolitanism, where one embraces all cultures and is at ease in most countries in the world. His writing, teaching, and intellectual activism are anchored in critical theory and pedagogy, influenced by writers such as Kafka, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Camus, and Steinbeck, and thinkers such as Friedrich Nietzsche, Hannah Arendt, Paulo Freire, Edward Said, Henry Giroux, John Dewey, Herbert Marcuse, Noam Chomsky, Eric Fromm, Jacques Derrida, and Michel Foucault. Kashani is the author of 5 books in humanities, Deconstructing the Mystic, Hollywood's Exploited, Public Pedagogy, Corporate Movies, and Cultural Studies, Lost in Media, Ethics of Everyday Life, and Movies Change Lives, a pedagogy of humanistic transformation. His chapter on critical media literacy in the 3-volume handbook on critical pedagogy is a deliberation and impact of new media on the human condition. Presently, he is completing his upcoming book, Deus Ex Machina, manuscript on the paradox of being human in the digital age. And I guess he's going to refer to some of the concepts that he has been thinking and writing about in this book in today's talk. On a personal side, he is practicing black belt in karate, and as a student of Zen philosophy, believes in balancing his life with mindfulness to result in a harmonious mind, body, spirit experience. And he lives with his family in the San Francisco Bay Area. So that's a really impressive bio and personal life history, Tony. I'm really glad that you accepted this invitation and decided to join us here. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mukherjee. Wonderful introduction. I'm humbled. Hello to everyone. I know it's morning for you. I hope you had your, I don't know if you're into caffeine or not, but the morning starter, so you can be sharp. I will preface my talk by saying that by no means in this limited time that we have together am I going to give you a comprehensive examination of neoliberalism, artificial intelligence, big tech, and all the intersections of these different factors, bringing us to the point of confusion, instability, uncertainty, but at the same time, optimism of the will today. But hoping to, through a series of slides and discussions, and hopefully, we'll have enough time to do a good, robust Q&A afterwards. we make a dent into the discourse. And of course, the discourse continues. And the struggle of humanity to push back against power continues, and all the rest of it. The idea is that we're committed to social justice, fairness, egalitarianism, and all of those combined hopefully make us an evolved human being on the planet, and a healthy and contributing members of the ecosystem. So I'm just going to go ahead and do a share screen here and go right to the slides and get going. Okay, let's minimize this. So as Dr. Mukherjee also mentioned, and it is the spirit and the mission of your university to be interdisciplinary scholars and inquirers. The approach that we must take into examining the human condition in this day and age has to be interdisciplinary. And in some ways, with a bit of hubris, I would say that perhaps we want to be transdisciplinary folks, where we go beyond the limitations of different disciplines that intersect and help us be informed and help us gain insights into what's going on. So is it a rabbit or a duck? Is it a rabbit or a duck with different colors? Or there is a rabbit or a duck kind of like overseeing things or looking up and trying to figure things out? We're not sure, but they're all there. They're all part of the process. I guess it is needless to say, however, here it is, I'm saying it, that we must take a global perspective. It's a necessity given the interdependence of humanity and the sharing of the crises, if you will, of the global climate change and the consolidation of power and manipulation of human behavior and all of these things that come into play to dictate everyday living for many folks on the planet. So it is necessary that we don't isolate our perspective into one region and then focus in that region and ignore other regions of the planet. So let's talk ontologically. What sort of environment do we live in? Of course, those of us who were born after the birth of the internet and then later with the smartphones and in the 2000s with the social media and all things internet and so on are affectionately referred to as the digital natives. In other words, the reality that the digital natives experience is the kind of reality that does not have boundaries between the physical presence and interactions and the virtual presence and interactions. The boundaries are blurred for the digital native. Whereas someone like myself, I can still remember fax machines. and I remember typing papers during my undergrad years on a typewriter and that sort of thing. And today I have to immerse myself in the digital world in order to survive as a scholar, as a professional, as a father, as a provider, and engaged citizen. So for me, it's a little different to see the gap between the digital natives and the digital immigrants. But we need to close the gap in order to build solidarity between the natives and the immigrants of the digital world, if we want to have consolidated power. So the ontology of the digital native is digital. The ontology of the digital immigrant is split. So, and then there is the gap. So we work on closing the gap. At least my scholarship, my looking at the world and my inquiries are concerned about closing that gap. I guess you could say what keeps me up at night is, how do I close the gap? How do I close the gap? And that sort of thing. So another question that comes up in this day and age is, do we live in a democracy? Many people are asking this question from themselves in different countries. For example, where you are in India, it is often referred to as the world's largest democracy. And democracies are messy processes, as I'll hazard a guess you will agree. So what does it mean to live in a system that is predicated on democratic principles? There are definitions, as you can see here. I have included, the etymology of the word, and I also have gone to the dictionary and given you the dictionary definition. But ultimately, it boils down to this bottom two lines: a system of government by the whole population or all the eligible members of a state, typically through elected representatives. You're probably thinking, well, no, duh, of course we know this, right? But sometimes being reminded of a definition of democracy is necessary for those who are under the assumption that they understand it and they're just trying to figure it out, right? How to improve one's democratic system, how to make changes within the system or from the outside, how to go from bottom to top and do a bottom-up change. And what happens from the top to bottom systems that try to operate within the framework of democracy, but to create a procedural democracy that is very effective, but manipulate the logic of movement for people being represented, who is being represented, and what are the powers behind that representation, and so forth. So when you look at current research, and Pew Research does a good job of sampling and offering an analysis, this graph kind of speaks to the dissatisfaction of people on a global scale around the world, of whether they're satisfied or not satisfied with the democracy that is given to them. So, and if you pay attention, the numbers don't add up to 100%. Those who weren't sure are not represented on this map, but that's the difference you can tell easily by just doing the simple math here. So Mexico is right on top of the map. 85% of Mexicans think that the democracy in their country is not working. And of course, Mexico is one of those rare North American countries that embraced neoliberalism very early on. And 14% think that, no, things are working out just fine. And then Greece requires no introduction. The birthplace of democracy has its population being severely dissatisfied with the democracy that the so-called democracy that works there. Now, you might be surprised at seeing United States of America right here in the top 10, as it were. 58% of Americans think that our democracy is broke. Well, perhaps it was by design by the elite who created the Constitution, and then today it's gotten to a point where the elite are the billionaire class, who are actually not nationals, but transnational people, because the billionaire class, whether they are from India or from the United States or from Russia or from Ukraine or from Japan and other places that are known as nation states, they travel in different spaces, and they are removed from the everyday living of the global citizens and so on. And down here, I was looking at these numbers earlier, and I was expecting India to be a little bit higher, given what's happening right now, and folks protesting the conditions, particularly in the farming sector in India. But then when I look at the study, it was done in 2018. This was prior to the pandemic, and we know the conditions have changed during the pandemic, and we're still dealing with the pandemic in many ways. So we're not post-pandemic in the endemic phase of the whole thing. So this invisible virus, this thing that we can't see and yet is so powerful, is exposing many hidden conditions that were under the veil before, and now we're seeing that the growing inequality as it was, and the progression of the inequality that we're seeing around the world. And what to do about it is what also keeps me up at night. Dr. Maun, of course, points out that it's not just travel. Billionaires can formally buy citizenship with their money. That's absolutely correct. You can go buy citizenship of Canada and the United States by having just enough money to do an investment into a business or properties and so on, and simply buy citizenship for yourself and your families. So, and that's just the cost of doing business and being transnational. So let's see if I can change this slide. What's happening here? Okay. So a quick definition of capitalism. Again, this audience is very learned, so you're familiar with capitalism, but it's good to just get on the same page together and just be reminded of simple introductions and definitions of things. So capitalism is essentially known as an economic system, but it's always political at the same time. So politics of capitalism are the engine that run the economic system, and then vice versa, depending on in the context in which they have to operate and so forth. Then we have the notion of democratic capitalism, which it may seem like an oxymoron. How could capitalism be democratic? Because it's based on the capitalists expanding the capital and exploiting labor and so forth. But particularly European nations have made a go of it, and they tend to be more democratic than, say, places like Ireland or the UK or the United States. And it is also referred to as market democracy. So in other words, opening the market up for competition rather than monopolies and so forth. So the varieties of capitalism are basically based on the contemporary theories, and most economists agreeing on this, and social scientists also kind of giving the nod to these categories. There's a new liberal market capitalism, which I'll talk about a little bit more down the road here as we move forward. And good examples of it are the US, UK, and Ireland, perhaps. Social market capitalism, countries like Germany, and most of, when I say Europe, I should change the slide. So most of Western Europe follow this model where there are social services and there is a safety net for the citizens of those countries, and yet things are capitalistic. You have gigantic corporations such as BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and others that are well-known brands around the world. And but they work in cooperation with other big corporations that may not be well known, but they're bigger, and they are conglomerates. And then, of course, right, the pharmaceutical companies of Germany are big ones. But the citizens of Germany don't live in this kind of uncertainty about the future when they become the so-called senior citizens, where they're in retirement and so forth, as much as other countries do. Developmental capitalism in Japan is still in that phase, and perhaps will always be in that phase, and most of East Asia can be considered part of the developmental capitalistic system, where the government is subsidizing manufacturing and global marketing for many companies, and continually developing. Then, of course, in China, we have the neoliberal model, but it's state-owned capitalism. That's a different animal in and of itself, which requires, hours of discussion just to bring it into the discourse. But I'll make, some points. I'll make some references to China when it comes to AI and so forth. So there's history to this stuff. Growth after World War II and last 3 decades. This figure kind of shows you what happened to the growth, right? In Europe, between 1950 and 1973, this is post-World War II, there's tremendous growth. And then something happened here, 1987 to 2017, which is not too far away from today. The growth significantly dropped. And then when you look at the US, the largest economy in the world, the growth difference is similar, but 87 to 2017 is a little bigger, perhaps because the United States is kind of a dominant empire right now, and there is a recommendation that adding Australia in the social market capitalism. Yes, Australia has had good success with its social programs, but continues to be, a capitalistic nation. And yes, Australia definitely belongs in that list. So just a couple of slides to show you, what people are thinking. These are the average people, young people who are worried about their future, and they're smart, and they're seeing the writing on the wall, and they're protesting. But to what extent, and to what degree is that? They're the questions that we must ask. If you're paying attention to the politics of the United States right now, there is a growing movement towards forming labor unions. Recently, Starbucks, which is a global brand and a conglomerate, a huge company, and employs thousands upon thousands of employees, 50 of their stores were successfully unionized. And they are fighting tooth and nail against more unionization of the other stores. But it's like a fire that they cannot put out. It's just growing and progressing. And of course, the success that one Amazon center had with unionization is showing the power of the masses. So right now, currently, the union representation in the US, it hovers around the 20% representation in both private and public sector combined. And that's a abysmal representation compared to, say, for example, European countries such as Germany. The World Inequality Report of 2022 came out, and I just wanted to offer you just like a nutshell analysis that they have produced. But it's worth your time reading the report, which you can download online. And these folks that actually authored the report, they're not by any means like the radical left and the crazies and the anarchists that want to change the world. They want to destroy everything and then bring it back up from the bottom. And yet they are looking at facts, and then they're bringing values into their analysis. And then bottom line is, we're talking about an ethical enterprise to save humanity, perhaps to save humanity from itself. So in a nutshell, in 2021, after approximately 3 decades of trade and financial globalization, this project of globalization, inequalities have remained extremely pronounced, according to this report. So, and they are very close to the imperialism period of the early 20th century. So some people, always use the analogy of the 20s, the Gilded Age, and what is happening today. And they're saying they're very similar in logic, and yet different, because in the past 30 years, we've had profound transformative changes in the world due to high technology and the advancement of high technologies. Whereas in the 20s, that wasn't the case. And yet, there was the consolidation of the rich class and, the Gilded period, where regulation was a thing of the past. And of course, a couple decades later, we see that the push against that and the movements towards unionization, social security, and safety nets, and social market capitalism, and so forth. So what has COVID done, according to this report, and Lucas Chancel, there's this quote from him: the COVID crisis has exacerbated inequalities between the very wealthy and the rest of the population. Yet in rich countries, government intervention prevented a massive rise in poverty. We saw that happening, like profoundly in Canada, where they were initially giving people 2,500 Canadian dollars a month to sort of, make them whole. And in the US, there's a couple of periods of giving money to people, and then it slowed down and eventually ended, and jobs are coming back and so forth. So it was averted, as it were. This was not the case in poor countries. Poor countries were just left hanging out to dry. And this is getting worse and worse as we speak. So it shows the importance of social states in the fight against poverty, according to the authors of this report, and I tend to agree with them. So what are the key messages of this? MENA, Middle East, North African nations, are based on the facts that the scholars have kind of extracted and analyzed, are the most unequal region in the world. And of course, Europe, no surprise, has the lowest inequality levels. We have, you know, in a few hundred nation states that we're looking at, many of them have become richer. But when we say that, it's not so much the governments that are in charge of distribution of wealth and so forth. There are a lot of rich people in this country. Some, you know, have risen their middle class to a point where there is actually a middle class. Then there is the 1%ers and then 10%ers who pretty much control what Noam Chomsky always calls the owners of society, control the apparatus and the distribution and the way in which wealth can be distributed. So when we take a look at the gap between the net wealth of governments and net wealth of the private and public sectors, we can see that there's a lot of money and wealth and resources available, and yet it's not in the hands of the governments of these countries. And that could change, right? So wealth inequalities have increased at the very top of the distribution. And privatization, of course, you know, has a lot to do with this. The top 1% took 38% of all the additional wealth, and I have a graph to show you here about that. Gender inequalities remain considerable at the global level, and progress within countries is just simply too slow. And then given the pandemic conditions, things are even slower. Then there is the huge alarm sign here that the G20 countries continue to ignore. Of course, they play lip service to it. The ecological inequality, their data shows that these inequalities are not just the rich versus poor country issue, but high emitters versus low emitters issue within all countries. And now we've got this war going on, and that's like a project between NATO countries and the United States and then Russia on the other end. And of course, the Ukrainians are the victims here, as is always the case, that some people are going to suffer massively as a result. And now some supplies are cut off, and then there's given justification for drilling for more oil, and you know, fracking is happening, and people are in Germany recently were talking about bringing back coal energy, at least temporarily. But you know, when they say temporarily, we have to be very careful about that. And Lucas Chancellor explains, there's another quote from him, global economic inequality fuels the ecological crises and makes it much harder to address it. It's hard to see how we can accelerate efforts to tackle climate change without more redistribution of income and wealth. So we've got to share the wealth is the answer here. So this figure, all the talk, we just look at the numbers, and this sort of like explains it. If somebody says, well, you know, people are much better off today than they were, say, you know, the early 20th century, just show them this numbers. And then say, go back and look at the numbers of the earliest 20th century. See what the top percent are doing here. They have control of 38% of the global wealth, right? And you know, their income is not as much as, say, the top 10% or the middle 40%, but that's a misnomer. They are in charge, right? And of course, you know, as it was pointed out in the chat box, you know, they can buy citizenship and they can change the equations in different nations. So with their wealth and that kind of power that yields and so on. So when people say, well, how did this happen? What's going on? How did all of a sudden, you know, everything just gone array, and what's going on? The short answer is, well, new liberalism happened, and there's history to this. It wasn't like it happened in a vacuum and it just happened overnight. We've been by we, I mean like the particularly, you know, the Anglo American forces have been at it for the past 40 years. So what's the main maxims of neoliberalism and market fundamentalism, if you like, would be the short phrase for it. The notion that markets on their own are basically efficient and fair, and should be relied upon for the allocation of scarce resources. In other words, a neoliberal person, somebody who advocates for neoliberal policies and privatization of everything and says, well, just, laissez-faire and freedom to do whatever we want with business, is saying that the market in and of itself is an ethics, right? Like, you don't need an ethical system to guide you when you do business. You don't need a set of principles to govern your ethics. You just let market dictate prices, market dictate the distribution of wealth, market dictate wages, and all the rest of it. Of course, historically, when we look at the numbers, we see that whole business of market being fair and the trickle down ideas and all of that, was a fallacy, and it hasn't happened. In fact, it's gone the other way around. It's been a trickle up kind of a system that has happened. So the logic of free market fundamentalism is an illusory logic, and one could say it's a fallacious logic. So they always say, if you recall, and today even, politicians are very happy to say this, and these are people who are running for government offices, right? Government is the problem, not the solution. So you get government out of the way, and then let the market just run itself, and we're all going to be happy and prosperous, and the world will come together and be one happy place for everyone. Long history motivated by politics, denigrating the role of the state. It's been an ongoing thing. And of course, if you know about, Keynesian economic systems, it's about, Keynesian system is about government entering the picture and intervening during a recession or a economic crises and political economic crises, and creating jobs, investing in businesses and infrastructure and so on. And this, in the United States, there's a history of, FDR being the leader of Keynesian economic project, creating Social Security and getting United States and many, many infrastructure jobs, getting United States out of what is known as depression period. And it was a project that worked quite well. And then for a long time, we had that system in place, where it was based on liberal policies of distribution of wealth according to those who are necessarily in need of social services, and then jobs provided by the government. And the government being a partner with private entities with regulation. Regulation was a big deal in Keynesian system. Once we did away with that, we started getting in trouble. See, do you remember these guys? Yes, of course. First came Margaret Thatcher, came to power, and a year later you got Ronald Reagan. They became buddies, and they were sincere advocates for neoliberalism, what they call the supply side economics. They were against communities, against unions, against solidarity. They were all for individualism and isolation of the individual. And Margaret Thatcher infamously said that there's no such thing as society, it's just individuals, right? They just live there, right? Which is a Hobbesian notion towards society, and it goes against the principles of democracy and unity and togetherness and cooperation and fair distribution of wealth and economic justice. And of course, along the way, the tool to move people away from paying attention to that sort of policy is to use identity politics, right? So the model is market mechanisms are used to regulate all or most aspects of the economy. I've said this before. So in other words, no regulation and individualism, of course. And the dominant philosophy is shareholder value. And they make no apologies for this notion that they are operating to protect the interest and improve the quality and the wealth of the shareholders. So maximum returns to the owners of capital. So in other words, unfettered, unchecked, and unbridled capitalism is the way to go according to them. So here's a little breakdown of how this came about. I won't go down the list here and just explain everything. I mean, this is not anything new to this audience. But the technocratic rule is an area that it's been written about by those who actually predicted this future. And then now we are at a point where tech optimism is in marriage with a technocratic logic of doing things. East Asian countries continue to pursue more developmentalist models and outperform other developing economies. And that's something that current research is showing. Where that goes after the pandemic, is under control. We shall see. So the business executives of the generation that came during the neoliberal era, they don't understand when they feel guilty about like laying a whole bunch of people off, like getting rid of small businesses so they can consolidate their own ownership and monopolize the market and all that. So this fellow, maybe he's a vice president of some big company. He goes to the doctor and says, "Oh, I got these pangs of conscience." He's faced with an ethical dilemma, and he says, "Well, maybe there's a remedy for it." Of course, today, and this may seem like a joke, but it really is not. You have people that, because they've grown up in this environment of this is ontological for them, right? This environment where there are no ethics, right? And the market is the ethics. They think, well, okay, let's have some scenarios. Let's feed those scenarios into AI, and then come up with an app, such as this one over here, that could tell people how to behave. Of course, right? The apps are written, the algorithms that are written into these apps are subjective. These are by people that use their values, their set of values, which is neoliberal values, into making decisions about ethical dilemmas. So independent thinking is out the window. All you need is just an app, right? And perhaps like Viagra, they can have enhancers for people who need extra conscience. And there are people that actually, I wouldn't be surprised, and I'm just hazarding a guess, that somebody like Elon Musk is, sitting around in somewhere with his other billionaire buddies and talking about this sort of thing, right? Saying, hey, why don't we just create something that gives people a sense of morality according to our set of values, according to our ethics, and they can judge it based on that. Then we can have pills and we can have technologies to take care of that. Now, I often use the allegory of the cave to kind of explain what's going on behind the scenes, and because things are happening in secret, especially when it comes to big tech, and I'm going to talk about that the next phase of our talk today. So those of you who are familiar with Plato's allegory of the cave, is a thought experiment, and these people are chained against this wall, and they can't turn and see what's behind them. And there are puppet masters behind this wall that show them shadows against, this fire creates the light for the shadows. So their reality is these shadows, right? And every now and then they give each other, awards and so forth. And one person gets freed and sees the sun, reasons about it, and then Plato says that he has a moral obligation to return to the cave and free others, even at the risk of his life. risk of death. So, who are the puppet masters? Today, we can identify many conglomerates that control the everyday life of us. I mean, without these technologies, many people cannot imagine living without these technologies. It's just like oxygen, right? They're famously or infamously known as the Big Nine. The big three up top, BAI, Alibaba, and Tencent, are the big Chinese tech companies. And the difference between those and the American companies that I've listed here is that the Chinese big tech is supplied resources, money and people and support by what in China they refer to as the General Wealth Fund. And the Communist Party is constantly feeding the R&D sectors of these companies. And Huawei and others who are in charge of infrastructure and hardware and so on, working in cooperation with Alibaba's and Bai's and Tencent's. And they create this massive paradigm in China that, believe it or not, has massive support by the middle class in China. I mean, you've heard of the social credit system that they have, and then, the Big Brother is always watching. There's cameras everywhere, and there is surveillance, and the form of capitalism that is done, like Shoshana Zuboff's famous phrase, she coined the term surveillance capitalism. She's correct. Happens by the support and under the umbrella of the government, and so their R&D can move fast because they don't have to worry about competition doing things in secret and so on, and they're all in it together. Then you've got Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, and IBM, and these companies combined are known as the Big Nine, that pretty much are the puppet masters behind the Plato's famous wall in the cave. So we live in a new ecosystem in the age of AI, right? AI is the code artificial intelligence to sort of refer to as what is the ecosystem in which we live. Getting on the road, traveling, making financial transactions, registering for a class in a university, anything that you do on a daily basis is somehow part of AI, and AI is part of it. This slide kind of just sort of exemplifies what goes on with an AI-driven ecosystem. So in an internet minute, that's 60 seconds. And this is on global scale, right? You look at this and look at different activities that happen in 1 minute. This is as of 2020. And I'm not going to just go down and call every one of them, but take a look at these examples. Like, for example, 1.3 million people log in Facebook in 1 minute, right? So imagine what happens in 24 hours. In some countries, Facebook is the internet for them. I know in some parts of India, that's the case. In many parts of Africa, that is the case. People do business with Facebook. People just get everything out of Facebook, news and connection to family and friends and communication and so on. And of course, when we say Facebook, we're talking about WhatsApp and we're talking about Instagram. They're owned by Facebook, and then of course Facebook itself. It's a world in and of itself, and of course Google is the other world, where people say, well, it's Google's world and we're just living in it. So people say AI this, AI that, but what is AI? What is it? Is it just a phenomenon that occurred in the last 10 years or so? Or how do we define it? Well, artificial intelligence has always been around. It's not a new idea, and it's not like one entity. It's everywhere. I mean, this slide kind of like points out to different aspects of AI: smartphone, PC, digital personal assistants, Google and the Amazon's, what is it, Alexa and Siri and the robots that are used in factories and robots that are used in restaurants and autonomous cars being worked on. And of course, there's the surveillance equipment and technologies and face recognition and all the rest of it, right? So here you can see, if you just pay close attention every day, just be introspective. What happens to you in relation to AI? How do you live life vis-a-vis AI? And you see that, many things are intersecting with AI. And who's in charge is the question. Are you in charge of AI, or is AI in charge of your life? It's a famous question. Perhaps, in American parlance, there was a quiz show known as the $64,000 show. And the ultimate question, if somebody answered it, would get $64,000. So this question of who's in charge, it happens to be a $64,000 question. Let's see what else we got in the chat. Okay. For those of you who are unfamiliar with algorithms, not science majors, math, and so on, engineering, etc., this simple graph kind of explains what an algorithm is, right? You've got a desired output that you want to have, and there's input goes into a system, right? A set of rules that you design. You can write it down on a piece of paper. You create an algorithm, right, to obtain the expected output from the given input. And the expected output is here. I'm going to use my cursor. And that's the logic of an algorithm, right? You need these set of rules. And so who puts the rules in there? The keywords that the AI must pick up and all the rest of it is a human being that subjectively creates the algorithm. So the initiator, the creator, if you will, the Zeus of algorithms, is always a human being. It happens to be increasingly ubiquitous. Male, it could be a white male or it could be a brown male from eastern part of the hemisphere or from the western part of the hemisphere. But it's predominantly men with a certain way of seeing the world. And if they're born in the era of neoliberalism, ethics is out the window. Ethical implications are not considered. The impact an algorithm would have is not considered, other than the desired outcome that oftentimes happens to be for profit, for interest, for control, for social control. That's the ultimate goal of big tech. So after the initial algorithms and human beings being in charge of it and all that, you get that thing started, right? You give birth to this new world. Then machine learning takes over. So machine learning is computers learning from other computers that initially were, designed and programmed by humans. And now that information vis-a-vis algorithms comes into the machines, who build their own algorithms predicated on the original algorithms. And then you get this kind of an ecosystem of the different activities of AI, depending on the context in which we're looking at. Yes, Deus ex machina, right? It's the machine of the gods. That's the literal translation of Deus ex machina, which was part of the tradition of the Greek theater. When they were in trouble during the play and they wanted to solve the play and end it, the apparatus would come down. It was the machine of the gods, and the gods would show up. It could be Zeus, it could be Hera or someone else, and they'd just take care of business, and then end of the play. Now, today, people think that machine learning is the ultimate answer to everything, and we're starting to get to a point where we expect more from technology than we do from human beings that initially created that technology, right? So much science fiction work has gone into kind of deliberating on these the outcomes of such systems. In the interest of time, I'm going to just move forward with the slides so we can have some time to talk with one another too. So let's look at the tech giants and how they fared during the before and after the pandemic. Right, in 2018, this is what they were worth. Let me take a look. The big nine are represented here. And oops, I went too far. Semiconductors, they quietly are behind the scenes, like Intel. There's a company called Cisco Systems, right? Cisco is a big company, right? And the infrastructure of the internet is, provided by Cisco. Apple continues to be the king of the hill. In 2018, it was worth $1.1 trillion. At one point, and perhaps it's still the case, the cash on hand that Apple Corporation had, that is cash, I mean, liquid cash that they had on hand, was more than what the US government had on hand, which was mind-boggling at the time. But hey, it's a 24-hour news cycle, and it came and went, and people don't even give it a second thought. Because once something becomes ubiquitous and it's a regular thing, and you don't see it anymore, and it just becomes part of the ontological world in which you live. Say, for example, the smartphones. Can you imagine, life without smartphones? Some people might. Some people have in the past lived without it, myself included. But we don't see it anymore. We expect it to be everywhere, right? Of course, we don't see it. We use it when we use it. But when it's broken, that's like what Martin Heidegger said, you only know the hammer when it's broken, right? Because this smartphone is an extension of our hands, arms, if you will. And when it breaks, we notice it. Otherwise, it's not noticeable. Same thing with wealth and power that is, under the control of certain entities. And given the keys are given to a handful of people that sort of just run things, and then we don't see it anymore because what they do is like the smartphones, it's everywhere, right? And when it's everywhere, we don't see it. So what happened to these companies in 2020? This is like when the pandemic was at its height, right? 2019 is when it just broke open, and then in 2020 you had it. So the numbers went up, as you can see from this slide. Right? And these are like the biggest companies. Colors represent, the different sectors of this global economy. There's the service sector, and there's the financial sector, retailing, Amazon, of course, right here is well represented. Walmart and Amazon are the kings of retail. And then you've got the Saudi Arabian company, Saudi Aramco, right? And given that they have so much oil in their country, and certainly not a democracy, right? So the COVID-19 crisis didn't hurt the big tech companies. In fact, it made them stronger. It was like feeding the gorilla to go from 350 pounds to 500 pounds. And how do you fight a 500-pound gorilla? It's a difficult task. It's doable, but difficult. So what about the individuals, the members of the billionaire class? Now, these guys are the most well-known villains of the story. Jeff Bezos, of course, continues to be the richest man on the planet, right? And what does he do with his extra money? I just fly to the space and come back and try to see if I can set up a business to send people to the moon and back just for fun. Of course, who's going to go up there? His billionaire, millionaire friends. Never mind that, does he have a moral obligation to pay taxes and help society and allow his employees to form unions and give them better wages, et cetera, et cetera. These are all the moral questions that we can ask, and people are asking all the time. So what happened during the pandemic? His wealth went up by 61.4%. Then, of course, we got Elon Musk, who is purchasing Twitter, his new toy, and he wants to run the world. He in my view, suffers from God complex, like many of them do. His income went up by 413%. So, he pays $44 billion. Part of the money coming because he wanted liquid cash from his friend Larry Ellison, the owner and dictator of Oracle. And when you compare that to what he has access to $126.2 billion in terms of wealth and resources and money and power, etc. It's not a big deal, really. Of course, Bill Gates is always in the mix. And then Mark Zuckerberg, right here, he had 85.9% increase. And of course, Warren Buffett, the king of real estate and properties and so forth, still lives in, where is he, in Nebraska? Yeah. Lives in the same house that he lived 20 years ago. So the total US billionaire wealth, it's represented here. And this is 3,956.2 billion, meaning it is almost 4 trillion that they had in additional wealth. So let's see. Here's a question. And perhaps in the Q&A, we can talk about this a little bit. Breaking up the tech giants, is that a good idea? Should we be thinking about, well, is capitalism going away? Are we able to upend capitalism and create kind of like a market economies that are not capitalistic? Well, it's a tough question to answer, but can we have competitive capitalism to go against monopolistic capitalism that the big tech has, and the oil and fossil fuel industry has had and continues to have? And of course, you've got the financial industry, and these guys are like a cartel, and the media ownership comes into. They're like a cartel that kind of cooperate with one another and don't cross borders unless once in a while they need to go to war against one another. Pure capitalism versus social democratic market economy, like some of the European nations have. Good ones are that you can look at, Denmark and Finland and places like that. But they're not like innocent nations that don't have a colonial past or anything like that. So let's not forget that part of the history and assume that they are the benevolent social democratic market economies. But in practice, in the present, they take care of their citizens. Right? So let's talk power, because what is it? It's power dynamics that we're talking about. Who's in charge? Who runs things? And where's power? Who has power? Who doesn't have power? How does it work? My work is informed when it comes to deliberation and discourse on power by the work of Michel Foucault, whom I hazard a guess is not an unknown person to this crowd. And I just cited two books here, his lectures on power, and of course the famous History of Sexuality, which is more than one volume, but there's just a picture of volume 1. He predicted neoliberalism long ago. He said it's coming, right? He didn't call it neoliberalism, but he talked about the conditions because it has to do with power. And how does that work? What is his theory of power, right? Here's a little concise kind of capsule of what he meant by power. Power is productive. It creates things, including freedom and resistance. In fact, when we think power, we should always think resistance. Resistance is part of power. What he called counter-conduct in terms of technocratic institutions, where an employee can always do counter-conduct within the system. And we see examples of it, like you go to get some social service organization to get something done, and that employee helps you out, right? Doing counter-conduct. Says, well, this is how you go around the regulation. This is how you go around the rules. This is how you go around this unfairness that is built into the system. So power is imminent in economic processes. Yeah, I mean, it's an obvious fact. Knowledge relationships and sexual relations, etc. There's power there. Power comes from below. It's not a dualistic relation between the powerful and powerless. It's not like, it's a binary thing. Somebody is powerful, another person is powerless. we're all part of the web of power. Right? Power is there. It's not something that you possess. It's something that, you know, it exists, and then you recognize it, and then you take action to have it for in the context in which you need power. Power should be thought about as so many strategies, not as domination. So they're intentional, I'm sorry, but not subjective. So power can be used to dominate, like, you know, the big tech companies do, or imperial powers do to smaller nations, or manipulation and so on. But it can also be used to create a bottom group that can push up against the power that's been consolidated on top, and then there's power going against power. But there is power, there is resistance. I already, you know, sort of like touched on that. And resistance is not something that comes from outside of power; it's within it, right? So I always tell my young students, and you know, or if it's a public talk and there's a young audience there, I said, look, don't make the assumption, don't believe in the assumption that you have no power. Don't say, oh, what can I do? I'm just one person, right? You're not just one person. We're all interdependent. We cannot, you know, live and exist on our own. We have to work with others. But imagine if you were able to build solidarity. And solidarities are built. They're not just given. It's not like organic thing that comes up. You have to work towards building solidarity. Then there is power, right? The power of one becomes power of all, etc. I just put this slide out here just to say, well, you know, these guys are the faces of today's tech barons and power. So now we're at the Q&A part, and I think we have some time to talk if you like. So let me stop share here, come back to the big screen.
Thank you so much, Tony. This was excellent. And I'm sure it's very helpful for our students who are here. I would now like to invite our audience, students and faculty and research fellows over here to share, to ask their questions. I can see there are some comments and questions already in the chat, but feel free to unmute yourself. You should be able to unmute yourself and ask the question. Who is going to go first? There's a question already on the chat from one of our students. Okay, let me read this question first. This is from one of our students, Tony. As the speaker mentioned, market dictates all the rules of the game. Does it mean we do not require regulation of ethics at all? And if we establish, will it be followed or of any use? Another question is whether there are any limitations to government intervention in the market.
Okay, there's a lot there. So let me see if I can back up here. I'm looking at the question as
total free market versus government intervention with some limitations.
Right. Yeah. So so it says all the rules of the game. If market dictates all the rules of the game, does it mean that we do not require regulation of ethics at all? Well, ethics is not something that you regulate. If we're talking about ethics based on universal laws of morality, of kindness, of fairness, of dignity, you know, Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher that gave us the birth of duty ethics in the modern, you know, sense, said famously that there's nothing intrinsic about the human condition other than the fact that we have a sense of dignity, right? So if you think about dignity, then wages for labor have to be fair, right? Because what is a company without its labor? Non-existent, right? You can have all the capital in the world. If you don't have the people to run it, even if you got machines, somebody's got to be in charge of the machines and so on. So but if you're talking about the code of ethics that corporations put together, their lawyers and lobbyists put together and put out there, well, yeah, some of it is quite questionable. All right. So, for example, Elon Musk talks about, well, we have to have, freedom of speech. Anybody should be on Twitter, and we cannot, censor people and all that. Absolute maximalist approach to freedom of speech. But in his code of ethics of his company Tesla, no one is allowed to criticize the policies of the company, criticize Elon Musk as a person and their managers and so on. And if you do, and people find out that you did it, you get fired. So that kind of regulation I can throw out the window, right? But if it's based on dignity, it's based on the kind of ethics that we think about every day, right? Everyday living, everyday activity, based on our moral guidance. It could be assisted by somebody's, philosophy of life, whether you're a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim. Perhaps there's assistance that comes from those systems that give you some guidance. But as an independent person, you can think about it and say, well, this is useful. This part of the 10 Commandments is good. I could use that. And then if you're in charge of a company, using that sort of humanistic approach to doing business will generate the kind of regulation that you need. So I guess that's my response to that part of the question. Let's see. There are other things coming up. Let me see what we got here. Ooh, this is a big one. A lot of knowledge happens within universities, but little commercializations. Do you think universities have power to shape the world, or they're just one of the minor actor in this new liberal world, a world where adjuncts are trying to save their jobs, and they're trying to shift pedagogies to prepare the students to work for these? Absolutely. I mean, this is an important thing to think about. What neoliberalism has done to education. I've got a whole 45-minute lecture that's available on YouTube on this topic. What has happened to education system, specifically in the US, but on a global scale, you can think about it. Yeah, so what's the purpose of higher ed universities? It used to be based on, whether it's Western philosophy, Eastern philosophy, it's about knowledge production, right? Knowledge production for humanistic values to be spread around the world. All right, that was the purpose of higher ed. But today, when we look at universities, how they operate, they're given keys that are handed to administrators who are trained in business schools to manipulate, to take control, and to exploit intellectual laborers. As it was written in the text in the Dr. Maun wrote. The adjuncts, right? And the term adjunct in and of itself is an indignified kind of term, and yet it's commonly used. The adjuncts are like the auxiliary faculty. Intellectual laborers are exploited, no benefits, no long-term contracts, temporary workers, not like the Uber drivers, right? The person who drives an Uber, oh, you're your own boss. You can determine what class you want to take, what ride you want to provide, and then we tell you the terms and conditions in which you have to follow. So when universities become institutions of high vocational training, and it's all about, well, you go to school to get a job, but you don't go to school to become a well-balanced human being and a future engaged citizen, to contribute to your society and the world by extension, and change the world for the better, but become this self-interested Hobbesian person, then we're in trouble. And judging from the conditions today, we are in trouble. So the universities are at a crossroads, right? Where do we go with this? There's a pushback by folks, like yourselves here in this place, where we get together and we have discourses about what to do. How to produce knowledge while we're struggling with this oppressive neoliberal system of operation of universities. So it's like coming back to the notion of power, right? It's there. The power exists. how do you resist it? How do you resist the administration? How do you do how do you conduct your classes, your seminars, your conferences, and take advantage of the opportunities where you can shape minds of, future doctors and engineers and, coders and people that are going to run the world in the future, but they're right there in your rooms, in your classrooms, in the seminar spaces and so forth, right? The mind, if we live the life of the mind, we can see clearly that our minds are malleable, right? We can shape the minds, not like manipulate and shape. So, oh, here, become a mini me. No, but malleable to a point where you show the fluidity of consciousness to the student and say, look, if you think for yourself, if you think about humanity, start out with your family and then go to your neighbors, and then the neighbors and community and the city and the region and the country and the world and so forth. You can see that we're all part of the same seamless web. And you could be an excellent accountant, right? And be good with the numbers, but an ethical accountant that thinks about the impact of his or her work. Who do you work for? And what do these moving of the numbers mean? What are the implications of it? And all of that. That is the role of us who work within these universities that pretend to be places of higher ed, but they're really training grounds for, that's their objective, for the future functionaries of this global neoliberal system. But resistance is part of that process. And they may be aware of it or ignore it, thinking that, we're the most powerful, right? But are they? I go with Antonio Gramsci. The pessimism of the intellect, but the optimism of the will. I see the ugly reality, but every day that I wake up, I say, well, today is going to be a good day. We're going to make a difference in this world. See where it goes.
Great answer, Tony. Hearing you makes us all feel optimistic.
Right. Yes.
Despite the surrounding environment, which is not very, uplifting.
Yeah. It's a funny thing being human, right? Schopenhauer said, I always use this, and my wife beats me up over this. So how many times are you going to say this? Schopenhauer said that the human existence was an error. But then he came back and said, well, we can find salvation in music and in Buddhist ethics, right? He was a big fan of Buddhism because it's predicated on compassion. It's predicated on, and then I'm a huge fan of Nietzsche and his work, where he says, the will to power and all that business, where he says that, you can see that there may be an illusion of limitation, but how are you going to know where those limitations are if you don't push past it and then see where the limitations are? Then you see in most cases that you can go beyond your limitations. So when people say, well, how are we going to change things? This just seems it's impossible, right? Nothing is, well, maybe it's just that's just how I'm wired, but I think many people, we're wired for survival, we're wired for progression. And I think change is possible, and we've seen it. Like in this country, in the United States, up until 1920, women of this country didn't even have a right to vote. When people hear that in other countries, they're like, really? Is that even possible? Yes, it was possible. But then something changed, right? They pushed and pushed and pushed, and the resistance was there. And then today, we have, women in charge of many entities in the country.
I'll take the privilege of chairing the session and ask you a related question to what my colleague Deepak Mon was actually trying to refer to. There have been a lot of incidents of, academic freedom of faculty under pressure. And talking about AI, artificial intelligence, and new technology, this meeting itself is this research seminar is getting recorded. There has been incidents where certain conservative groups within the classroom itself, recorded something and posted it online, and it went viral, and faculty have gotten, thrown out from their jobs. And this is not just here in India; it has happened, I know, even in the United States and other parts of the world. And it's now you showed us rays of hope, quoting from Antonio Gramsci and even Foucault, that wherever there is power, there's resistance, and also from Schopenhauer and all. It sounds uplifting, as I said, but we all know the ground reality, and particularly with AI and all these mobile technology, how difficult things have become on the ground, particularly for academics to exercise their academic freedom. I'd like to hear some of your thoughts and reflections on this. Right now in Ukraine, academics are hugely under pressure. The other day, I was listening to another seminar, colleague from the University of Hong Kong, Center for Comparative Education, himself from Ukraine, diasporic academic, with the situation over there with regards to academic freedom, under a lot of pressure. So I just wanted to hear your reflections.
Yeah, it's a reality that people face in every country, right? The limitations of what used to be, well, you get academic freedom. In other words, you can say anything you want. You could be, because it's all about knowledge production, right? And then there's always going to be another voice that comes in, perhaps diametrically opposed to yours. And then we can have discourse, debates, and so on. But today, that's like a one-way street in many ways. It's like you follow this syllabus, and if you go outside the syllabus, we'll find, because of performance management, right? Assisted, like, pinpoint performance management assisted by AI. So you've got many of the online universities have this system in place where you're constantly under surveillance when you're teaching a class. So you say some things, then the system picks up the keywords. Say, like it's a class on political science, and then you talk about the oppression of the apartheid system in occupied territories in Palestine. And then the AI picks up apartheid, Palestine, and then sends it to a report that is generated for the manager that reads these reports for faculty conduct. And if somebody makes a complaint, of course, he's not going to send you an email and say, don't say that. But if one student makes a complaint, oh, this guy is, anti-Semitic, blah, blah. Next thing you know, you're getting that email that it's not even generated by that assistant dean or whomever. It's generated by AI. It says, okay, well, this is the letter we're going to send this guy. And then if you don't respond, and if you don't say, succumb to it and write, I had to do one of these. This is like 10 years ago. I had to write a letter. They forced me to write a letter explaining why I was discussing Palestine in a film class, right? And it went away, of course, right? But in some cases, it doesn't go away because you push back against it, and they're like, oh, okay, so you're not playing ball, and then you're out. And that's why the adjunct system is so oppressive. It's like, you're in chains everywhere you go, and then the more surveillance is available to the managers, and the more control they have. As I said earlier in the talk, we are talking about not just, the freedom to shop whenever we want, convenience, give your privacy in exchange for convenience and all that. It goes way beyond that. It has to do with control. And by they, I'm talking about, big tech, who is also part of the government, right? If you talk about China, that's directly the case. In other countries, the billionaire class pretty much tell governments what to do. They want social control. Mm-hmm. And, but, I don't know, maybe I have an easier time of it because I I live in the Bay Area, and this is more or less, we have more academic freedom in other places. But I work for universities sometimes, where I have to just sort of like toe the party line and just be liberal and not, challenge some students. But it's a bargain one makes of picking battles. So what I say to that is that, let's become more pragmatic to a point where we pick our battles, right? Because we still, at the end of the day, we have to make a living. We have a responsibility to our families. But that doesn't mean that we have to sell out and we have to just give up our principles. But it means that we become pragmatic and we find the battles where we can win and make a difference. And then we sort of like move away from battles that we know we're going to lose. But so, on principle, I'm just going to stand up to this. Well, you stand up to it, they push you out the door and then bring somebody else who's willing to be a willing functionary of the system. And that's the whole business of hegemony, right? Well, people voluntarily hand the controls over to big media, big, administration at universities and so on. But I'm not going to sugarcoat it and oversimplify it. It's a difficult thing to do, to navigate in these really dangerous terrains for one's career, for one's life, and one's livelihood, etc. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tony. What I understand, I hope I understood you clearly, is we have to be wise where we, choose to exercise our freedom.
Yeah, as someone who's been burned a few times, I can say, yeah, look for wisdom. Wisdom comes with what? Experience, and then learning from the experience. There's a lot of old people who don't have any wisdom because they just kept not learning. Right? What was it that Samuel Beckett said about failure? He says, you fail, next time fail better. And so hidden in that is that the lesson is, well, learn from your failure. And then next time you fail, you know how to fail. And then the time after that, perhaps, you win a battle and then you make a difference in somebody's life. We can, and we have, I'm sure, I'm assuming you make difference in people's lives all the time with your students and other colleagues who are here. And we make a difference. It may not be obvious to us, may seem invisible, and you hear about it every now and then, but it's always worth it, in my opinion, right? But that's just me saying these things.
I hope this was a really good learning experience for our research fellows and also our academic colleagues who are here in this room today. And I can see, okay, there's a comment here from one of our doctoral students saying, let's be optimistic and shift our energies to what we can create. Thanks for the great session, and I have learned a lot from this session.
Well,
and
thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Tony, on behalf of all of us. And we are at the end of the session. And I know it's quite late for you over there in the Bay Area. You might be feeling very tired, need to take rest and go to bed. So we are not going to hold you back for too long. Thank you so much for this session. It was really enlightening, and it was lovely to hear you speak directly after such a long time, even though it's on the digital platform, but I can see you are right there in front of me. So that even this animated speech, virtually, was really great to hear after a long time. And I'm sure this was a wonderful learning session for our faculty colleagues and our research fellows. And we really would love to welcome you to our campus. As I said before this session, sometime if you ever happen to travel in this part of the world, just let us know. We would love to host you at our campus. Sometime we have a very beautiful green campus. You must have heard a lot about Delhi pollution, but we are not in this Delhi city proper. We are in the national capital region, a little far away from the city. We are just surrounded by farm fields from all sides. And our campus itself is lots and lots of trees. It's very green, beautiful campus. So it's a little island sort of, like an oasis in the middle of a desert. So
Ah,
I hope you would love to visit us sometime whenever it's possible
I
in the
will
future.
look forward to that. And this was an honor and a privilege. Thank you for spending the time with me, everyone.
Thank you for sharing your time with us. If you were here on campus, then we would have shared some gifts and, probably also had a dinner with you here, but we can't do that virtually, unfortunately.
I'll make a
Only
rain
thing I
check
can
on it.
Right. Only thing I can do is I can just say namaste and thank you once again. And I hope you have a good night's sleep. And thank you on behalf of the entire team. And with that, I would close this session of Thinking Thursdays Research Seminar. And we'll look forward to see you on campus sometime in the future.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Bye-bye. Ajay, you can stop the recording. Thank you so much.